retain the high ground and deal primarily with the intellect, where it's a pretty safe place to be. So one of the questions we wanted to find out is if there are places that are emphasizing spirituality, and there are lots of students who do it, are they not doing then other things that we know matter to the kinds of outcomes we're after? And the answer is no. That is, it doesn't make any difference how often a person was engaged in spirituality activities. It wasn't limiting their contact with faculty. It wasn't limiting the kinds of other things that they might do, contacts with people from diverse backgrounds and so forth and so on. It's just this was another dimension of their lives that they were deepening. And you know, so we had about 460 institutions in this. The second outcome was, it was a bit fuzzier for us to draw this conclusion, but it had to do really with what the institution said was important in terms of its mission statement. But really, the takeaway from this is, you know, we do all this stuff with IPEDS data and Carnegie type and so forth and so on, and those things predict almost nothing in any systematic way about what matters, including money, which again I mentioned earlier, and we can come back and talk about it. Finally, and this was we looked at the set of, you know, we can be, I guess, criticized for saying, how did you decide which were faith-based and which weren't? And we looked at the membership in the Christian College Coalition. It has a different name now. And we had 29 institutions that we thought were much more closely tied to the denominational base and so on. And no surprise that those kinds of places, students spent more time in spirituality enhancing activities, and they also reported much greater gains in deepening their sense of spirituality, but at a small price. They then were a little less likely at these places to be introduced, for example, to diverse perspectives in the classroom. Not a surprise. And some of the other outcomes there. Again, we've got a paper and a much longer report if you're interested in digging deeper. But the big takeaway was, on balance, across the board, spirituality at worst, that is engaging in such practices, had, at worst, a salutary effect across the board on other matters. Well, there are some other things that we've been doing recently, looking at what happens when students engage in certain kinds of activities that AAC&U and some others have labeled, for the purposes of this generation, high impact. And I just reminding us where this work has come from, and this AAC&U work. And I just want to rivet us on a couple of these outcomes when I talk about these high impact activities. And we could spend a lot of time just defining what these are. Let me just point out a couple of things. When we talk about first year seminars here, this is not the traditional orientation to college seminar. This is a discipline-based, credit-bearing course, typically taught by a full-time faculty member, often with lots of other bells and whistles. It could well be a freestanding one-course learning community, because it oftentimes has a student affairs practitioner or an IT person or a librarian, and oftentimes will have an upper division, a peer preceptor working in the course with them. But you can look at this list and you can come away in your own mind's eye of the definitions. The learning community is very simple definition. Students who take 2 or more of the same courses together, so no additional bells and whistles here. We weren't talking about whether it has a residential component or not. So pretty simple. There it is. Why don't we dial in this time and see who's there? These things, not just NESI data, but a lot of other data coming out of other places. The diversity issues, for example, coming out of the work at UCLA and Michigan and so forth and so on. These students who report doing these things or having more experiences in these areas across different kinds of studies and measures tended to benefit more. And when we began to pick these apart by asking more specific questions, so-called, we call them experimental questions, additional questions on NESI, here's the walk-away. Let's just look at first-year students, just because it's simpler and so on. Here we have self-reported outcomes. Remember, I had the deep learning scale, or that proxy. And then I've highlighted the gains in the personal development area, because this is where the character stuff falls, a sense of self and so on and so forth, interest in the other. And of course, like Sandy's work, when you have 1,000 institutions and 400,000 students, every time you analyze something, it's statistically significant. So the question is now, what the hell really matters here? And the plus signs here are representing the magnitude of the differences. So in our business, we're calling these effect sizes. So it's the size of the difference between those who do and those who don't. Everything's statistically significant. But when you get 3 plus signs, we're talking here about maybe close to a full standard deviation of difference between those who do and those who don't. In the vernacular, something real is going on here. So students who've been in the learning community report much greater gains across the deep learning measure and in all the other areas of self-reported outcomes. Again, self-reported. These might be muted if we had pre-college controls, but I'll go back to the Wabash National Study, which does have pre-college controls, and they're finding the same pattern, if not the same magnitude of effects. So Lena, do learning communities matter? I guess, and we don't even know how good these are. You know, all we know is the student said I did it, because some learning communities are not so good. Just like certain service learning experiences aren't as strong, perhaps, as some others. And you see the same pattern of effects for seniors, where upper class students are more likely to do it. Got 10 minutes? We'll go through lunch. I'll finish up. Why? So we get to the why. And let me just race through the why. Why is because what I've already said. These students are more engaged across the board on everything else that they report on NESI. They're more academically challenged, they do more active and collaborative learning, they interact with faculty more, they see the campus environment as being more supportive across the board. You all can draw the conclusions about peer effects here. Why is this? It is, and we can dig it deeper. So across these high impact activities, and my argument by extension is the same thing if we focused exclusively on character development. These are students who are more involved. They've invested more time and energy. They didn't necessarily sign up for these things thinking they'd do it. They just got sucked in. They interact more with their teachers and peers about substantive matters. They're working with people that they would not have chosen to work with in a service learning activity or in a learning community, or they're studying abroad with people that they didn't choose to study, and now they got to figure out how to manage these differences. They get more feedback in real time. You know, something happens in the lab, something happens in the field, in a service learning or internship, and you got to respond. And then there's this notion, you know, one of the things that we haven't devoted enough time adulating Chick for was this early work about the importance of reflection and integration. And that's the one piece here that gets slippery, because we're not sure how much of this goes on in each of these things, but it is the key to the kinds of outcomes we're after. And then what do most students want? They want to know, is this going to matter to me in my life, in the real world? Do these things have any meaning? So this is a student pilot who aced the written portion of the exam. So you can't go anywhere today without quoting Tom Friedman, but you also ought to quote a Texan too. Wither. You know, if all we ever do is all we've ever done, then all we'll ever get is all you ever got. Meaning, we can do the same things, we can try to do more of the same things, we can do them over and over again, and we're going to be in the same, pretty much in the same place, right? So, I mean, we know how to get to the top of this mountain, not with every student, not every year certainly, but the only way we're going to move the numbers, so to speak, if the number is a reasonable representation of what we're after, is we got to do some different things. We got to ask students to do the things that we know, in fact, will matter. And we've talked about these things already. And yes, perhaps, you know, this is a cohort of students coming in more predisposed, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll do it. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll be, and the volunteer experience is probably not as powerful as service learning, because service learning has the typically built-in reflection and integration component. And so we know what these other things are. So can you imagine what your institution would be like